The shuttle dropped through the clouds of Aethara, like a stone sinking into golden water. Sergeant Ethan Cole pressed his face closer to the small window and watched the capital city reveal itself below. Towers of white crystal, climbing so high they disappeared into the haze. Bridges of light connecting them like threads of a web. And gardens the size of entire Terran cities spread across floating platforms that drifted slowly above the ground. He had seen pictures during the briefing. Pictures did not come close. "You gonna stare at it the whole way down? Or are you gonna help me fix this strap?" Danny Marsh said from the seat beside him, fighting with a buckle on his chest plate that had jammed again. Ethan reached over without looking and popped the buckle free with his thumb. Danny grunted a thank you and leaned back. Captain Grace Ellison sat at the front, back straight, hands resting on her knees, calm as still water. She had been chosen to lead the diplomatic escort because she never lost her composure, not even when things went sideways. Behind her sat the 4 members of the actual diplomatic team, civilians in press suits who looked like they had not slept in days. And filling the remaining seats were soldiers of the Terran 9th Expeditionary Unit, Ethan and Danny among them. They were not an impressive group by galactic standards. Their uniforms were dark gray and simple. Their weapons were ballistic, projectile-based firearms that most advanced species had abandoned centuries ago. Their ship, the carrier that had brought them to this system, was one of the oldest still in active service. Everything about the human delegation said the same thing. We are new here, we are small, and we do not have much. But they had been invited. 50 years since first contact, and for the first time, the Dominion of Aethara had opened its doors to humanity. The Dominion controlled over 300 star systems, and had existed for longer than human civilization itself. An invitation to their imperial court was not something you turned down. The shuttle landed on a platform at the edge of the palace complex. When the doors opened, the air hit Ethan like a warm hand, sweet, thick, and carrying a scent like flowers he had no name for. The sky above was pale violet, and the light from the system's twin suns gave everything a soft golden glow. An escort was waiting for them. Aetharan soldiers stood in 2 perfect lines, tall and slender, their armor a deep blue that seemed to shift color when they moved. The Aetharans themselves were striking, pale skin with faint silver markings along their cheekbones and temples, eyes that were large and bright, and a grace to their movements that made even standing still look elegant. They were beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, and they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of a species that had ruled the stars for thousands of years. A steward stepped forward. He was older, his silver markings more pronounced, and he wore robes of deep red. He introduced himself as High Steward Rothan, and welcomed them with words that were polite, but carried no warmth. His eyes moved over the human group slowly, and Ethan could feel the assessment happening in real time. The plain uniforms, the visible scars on Ethan's hands and face, the slight limp in his step as he walked down the ramp. Rothan's gaze paused on the limp for just a moment before moving on. They were led through corridors that stretched so far ahead they seemed to bend with the curve of the building itself. The walls were carved with scenes from Aetharan history, battles, treaties, coronations, all rendered in stone so fine it looked alive. Other species moved through the halls around them. Tall insectoid figures with clicking mandibles, short, dense beings wrapped in metallic cloth, slender creatures with too many eyes who moved in pairs and whispered to each other as the humans passed. Every one of them looked at the humans, some with curiosity, a few with something colder. The quarters they were given were at the far edge of the guest wing, about as far from the throne chamber as it was possible to be, while still being inside the palace. The rooms were comfortable enough, clean, well lit, with furnishings that adjusted to the size of whoever sat in them. but the message was clear. The humans were guests, but only barely. Danny dropped his bag on a bed and looked around the room. You know what this reminds me of? That time they put us in the storage building on Kepler Station because the officer barracks were full. Storage building had better food, Ethan said. Danny laughed. That is probably true. Captain Ellison gathered the team in the main room and went over the schedule. There would be a formal reception the following evening, where all delegations would present themselves before the Empress. Until then, they were free to move within the guest wing, but should avoid wandering the palace unsupervised. She reminded them that they were representing all of humanity, and that first impressions in a place like this could shape relations for generations. So behave, she said, looking directly at Danny. I always behave, Danny said with a grin that suggested the opposite. Later that evening, Ethan stood on a small balcony outside his room. The city below glowed with soft light as the sun set, and the floating gardens drifted like slow clouds. Somewhere in the distance, music played, something with strings and a low hum that vibrated in his chest. He did not notice the figures on the balcony above him. Princess Ilvara, youngest daughter of Empress Salith, stood with two of her attendants, looking down at the guest wing. She had watched the humans arrive earlier from her private tower, and she had not been impressed. Now she could see one of them standing alone on a balcony, a short, scarred figure in a plain gray uniform, staring at her city with wide eyes. Look at him, she said to her attendants, her voice light with amusement. He stares at our buildings like a child seeing fire for the first time. One of her attendants, a young woman named Cythera, smiled politely, but said nothing. Ylvara tilted her head. These are the Terrans everyone has been talking about? The ones who fought the Krev on the border? They look like servants who wandered into the wrong hall. Cythera and the other attendant laughed softly, because that was what you did when a princess made a joke. Below them, Ethan shifted his weight off his bad leg and leaned against the railing. He had no idea he was being watched. He was thinking about the reception tomorrow and whether the food would be something humans could actually eat. He was thinking about the long walk through those corridors, and whether his leg would hold up without showing the pain. He was thinking, as he often did, about the people he had lost in the border wars, and whether any of this, the diplomacy, the handshakes, the fancy palaces, would mean anything in the end. He took a deep breath of the sweet alien air, let it out slowly, and went back inside. Above him, the princess turned away and forgot about him entirely. She would not forget him for long. The throne chamber of Aethara was the largest enclosed space Ethan had ever seen. The ceiling rose so high above them that it disappeared into a soft glow of light, and the walls were lined with living crystal that pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat. Hundreds of figures filled the hall, delegates from across the Dominion and beyond, each group dressed in the colors and styles of their homeworld, standing in clusters and speaking in voices that blended into a low, constant hum. At the far end of the chamber, on a throne carved from a single piece of pale stone, sat Empress Salith. She was not what Ethan had expected. He had imagined someone grand, decorated, covered in jewels and robes. Instead, the Empress wore simple white, with no ornament except a thin band of silver across her forehead. She was tall, even by Aetheran standards, her silver markings deep and complex, spreading from her temples down along her neck. Her eyes were dark, and they moved slowly across the room, missing nothing. She looked like someone who had seen everything the galaxy had to offer, and had decided, quietly, what mattered and what did not. Beside her sat Princess Ylvara, dressed in blue and gold, her posture perfect, her chin slightly raised. Where her mother was still and calm, Ylvara was restless. Her eyes darted from one delegation to the next, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. The ceremony began with the oldest and most powerful delegations first. Each group approached the throne, made their formal greeting, and offered gifts or declarations of continued friendship. The Korvathi brought a star map etched in living metal. The Syndicate of Rule presented a device that could purify entire oceans. The insectoid Vreth performed a synchronized movement that was half dance and half military display, clicking and humming in perfect unison. Each presentation was met with polite acknowledgement from the Empress, and varying levels of interest from the court. The humans were called last. Captain Grace Ellison led the way. She walked with steady, measured steps, her uniform pressed and clean, her expression composed. Behind her walked the 4 diplomats, and flanking them were Ethan and Danny, along with 2 other soldiers from the unit. They carried no gifts, they brought no spectacle. They were just people in gray uniforms walking across a crystal floor toward the most powerful woman in the known galaxy. The hall grew quieter as they approached, not silent, but the conversations dropped to whispers. Ethan could feel eyes on them from every direction. He kept his gaze forward, locked on a point just above the Empress's throne, the way he had been trained to do during formal events. His leg ached with every step, but he kept his stride even. Captain Ellison stopped at the proper distance, bowed respectfully, and spoke. Her voice was clear and carried well in the vast room. She delivered the message from the Terran president, simple words about peace, cooperation, and the hope that humanity and the Dominion could build something meaningful together. No grand promises, no dramatic gestures, just honesty. It was, Ethan thought, the most human thing they could have done. The Empress watched and listened. Her expression gave away nothing. But Ylvara's expression gave away everything. The princess had been leaning back in her chair with the kind of relaxed posture that said she had already decided this was not worth her attention. When Ellison finished speaking and the hall waited for the Empress to respond, Ylvara leaned forward instead. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the chamber carried it to every corner. "Is this your warrior?" she said, her bright eyes fixed on Ethan, the one standing to your left, with the damaged leg. Ellison did not turn. "Sergeant Cole is part of our security detail, Your Highness." Ylvara tilted her head, studying Ethan the way someone might study a strange insect. "He limps like a wounded herd animal. On Athara, we would not allow such a creature to guard a stable, let alone a diplomat." The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of reaction spread outward. A few laughs from delegates who enjoyed seeing the newcomers put in their place, uncomfortable silence from others, and a sharp intake of breath from one of the human diplomats standing behind Ellison. Danny Marsh's hand drifted toward his sidearm. It was not a conscious decision. It was instinct, the kind of reaction that came from years of watching your people get threatened. His fingers brushed the holster before Ethan gave him a single look. Not a word, not a gesture. Just a look that said clearly and completely, "Stand down." Danny's hand moved away. Ethan turned his eyes back to the front. His expression did not change. He did not flinch, did not tighten his jaw, did not shift his weight. He stood the way he had stood on a dozen battlefields, steady, present, and unmoved. Ylvara waited for a reaction. When none came, something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but surprise. She had expected the human to crumble, or to flush with shame, or to stammer some defense. His silence confused her, and confusion, for someone like Ylvara, quickly turned to irritation. She pressed harder. "Perhaps they do not understand our language," she said, addressing the court now, rather than the humans. "Or perhaps they are simply too dull to know when they have been spoken to." She paused and smiled. It would explain why they brought words as a gift instead of something of value. More laughter, though it was thinner this time. Some of the older delegates shifted uncomfortably. High Steward Rothan, standing to the side of the throne, watched with a carefully blank expression. Captain Ellison responded before the laughter faded. Her voice was level, with no trace of anger. "We brought what we have, Your Highness. On Earth, a person's word is considered valuable. We hope in time to demonstrate why." Ylvara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the Empress raised one hand. A small gesture, barely noticeable, but it silenced the entire hall, as though a switch had been flipped. Salith looked at the humans for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and measured. "The Dominion welcomes the Terran Alliance. You may take your place among the delegations." That was all. No comment on her daughter's words, no reprimand, no praise, just acknowledgement and dismissal. Ellison bowed again, turned, and led her team back across the floor. The walk back felt longer than the walk forward. Ethan could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against his back, but he did not hurry, and he did not slow down. When they reached their position along the far wall, Danny leaned close and whispered, "I want to go home." "You wanted to come," Ethan said quietly. "Past me was an idiot." The reception continued around them. Other delegations mingled and spoke. Servants moved through the crowd with trays of food and drink that glowed faintly in colors Ethan did not have words for. They stood in their small group, a gray island in a sea of color and light. Captain Ellison stood with her hands behind her back and her eyes on the room. She did not let the frustration show, but Ethan could see it in the way she held her shoulders, tight and high, the way she got before a difficult briefing. "She is a child," Ellison said, so quietly only Ethan and Danny could hear. "A powerful child, but a child. We do not react to children." Ethan nodded. Across the hall, Ylvara was laughing with a group of Korvathi delegates. She gestured toward the humans once, and the group laughed with her. She looked confident, pleased with herself, certain that she had read the situation correctly. The humans were weak. The humans were beneath her. The humans did not belong here. But from the throne, Empress Salith was not laughing. She sat perfectly still, her dark eyes resting on the small group of humans standing alone against the far wall. She was watching the scarred soldier who had not flinched, and she was thinking. The explosion came at the worst possible hour, deep in the night cycle, when the palace lights had dimmed to a soft glow, and most of the court was asleep. Ethan was not asleep. He rarely was. Sleep had become a difficult thing for him after the border wars, something that came in short, shallow pieces rather than full nights. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, cleaning his rifle by the faint light of a wall panel, when the floor shook beneath him, and a deep boom echoed through the walls. He was on his feet before the sound faded. His hands moved without thinking, rifle assembled, magazine loaded, boots on. Years of combat had turned these motions into something automatic, something that happened whether he was ready or not. Danny rolled out of his cot in the next room, already reaching for his weapon. "What was that?" Danny asked. "Breach," Ethan said. He had heard enough explosions to know the difference between an accident and an attack. That sound had come from below them, from somewhere deep in the palace structure, and it had the sharp, focused quality of a shaped charge, something designed to cut through barriers. The alarm started a moment later, a high-pitched tone that pulsed through the corridors. Aetheron emergency lights activated, turning the hallways a deep orange. Captain Ellison's voice came through their communication units, calm and steady. "All personnel stay in quarters. Palace Guard is responding." Ethan listened to the alarm and the distant sounds beneath it. More explosions, smaller this time, and the unmistakable crackle of energy weapons firing. He looked at Danny. "That is not under control," he said. Danny nodded. "No, it is not." Ethan opened the small display unit on his wrist. During their first day at the palace, while the diplomats had been resting, and Danny had been complaining about the food, Ethan had done what he always did in a new environment. He had studied the layout. Every corridor, every junction, every emergency exit. He had memorized the tactical map of the palace complex the way a musician memorizes a song. Not because anyone ordered him to, but because it was who he was. Now that map told him something the palace guard might not have figured out yet. The explosions were coming from the old service tunnels that ran beneath the eastern wing, and those tunnels led directly to the Empress's private chambers. "Danny," he said. "Yeah, I know," Danny said. He checked his rifle and nodded. "Let us go." The corridors were chaotic. Servants running in every direction. Delegates standing in doorways, looking confused and frightened. Aetheran guards rushing past in groups, their blue armor flashing under the emergency lights. Nobody paid attention to two humans in gray. Ethan navigated from memory, cutting through side passages and service doors that brought them closer to the eastern wing, while avoiding the main corridors where the confusion was worst. Danny followed half a step behind, covering their rear, moving the way they had moved together through 100 bad situations before this one. They reached the eastern wing in minutes. The sound of fighting was louder here. Energy blasts, shouting in a language Ethan did not understand, and the deeper crack of ballistic weapons that did not belong to any Aetheran. Krev weapons. He recognized them instantly. The Krev hegemony used a type of heavy projectile rifle that made a sound like splitting wood. He had heard that sound more times than he could count during the border wars. They turned a corner and found the corridor leading to the Empress's private chambers. Two Aetheran royal guards lay on the floor. One was clearly dead, a hole burned through his chest plate. The other was alive, but unconscious, bleeding from a wound on his head. Ahead of them, 4 figures in dark armor were working on the sealed doors to the Empress's wing. They moved with the precise, efficient motions of trained operatives. Krev insurgents, smaller than Aetherans, stocky and dense, with ridged skin and 4-fingered hands that moved with frightening speed. One of them had set up a cutting tool on the door. The seal was already halfway breached. Sparks flew in a bright orange arc across the hallway. Ethan dropped to one knee and raised his rifle. Danny slid into position beside him, weapon up. There was no time for a plan. They had fought together long enough that words were not necessary. Ethan fired first. The round took the nearest Krev in the side and spun him into the wall. Danny's shot followed a heartbeat later, catching a second operative in the leg. The Krev reacted instantly. They were professionals, fast and disciplined. The remaining 2 dropped behind cover and returned fire, their heavy projectiles tearing chunks from the crystal walls. The corridor became a hell of noise and dust. Ethan advanced, firing in controlled bursts, keeping his shots tight and accurate. A round passed so close to his head that he felt the heat of it on his ear. He did not stop. He had learned a long time ago that stopping was dying. Danny moved to flank from the right side. A Krev round caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled, hitting the wall hard. He cursed through gritted teeth, but kept his rifle up, firing one-handed while pressing his back against the wall for support. 2 Krev were down. The third took a round from Ethan's rifle and fell. The fourth, the one with the cutting tool, abandoned the door and charged. Ethan's rifle jammed. It was the kind of thing that happened with older weapons, the kind of thing that the Aetherans would have pointed to as proof of human primitiveness. Ethan did not think about that. He let the rifle drop on its strap and pulled his combat knife. The Krev hit him hard, and they both went down. The insurgent was strong, stronger than a human, and his armored hands closed around Ethan's wrist, trying to pin the knife. Ethan's bad leg screamed with pain as they rolled across the floor. His vision narrowed to just a face in front of him. Ridged skin, dark eyes, teeth bared in effort. Then the Krev pulled a concussion charge from his belt and activated it. The blast threw Ethan backward into the wall. The world went white, then dark, then came back in pieces. Fragments of light, the ringing in his ears so loud it drowned everything else. The taste of blood in his mouth. He was on the floor. The ceiling above him pulsed with orange emergency light. He got up. His body did not want to. Every part of him was screaming to stay down, to give in, to let someone else handle this. But Ethan Cole had been getting back up his entire life. He had gotten up after his parents died when he was 17. He had gotten up after the Battle of Kepler Ridge, where he had lost half his squad. He had gotten up after the injury that gave him the limp that a princess had mocked just hours ago. He got up because that was the only thing he knew how to do. The Krev was on the ground too, dazed from his own charge. Ethan crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and drove the knife home. The insurgent went still. The corridor was silent, except for the alarm and the sound of Ethan's breathing, ragged, wet, painful. He turned and positioned himself in front of the damaged doors to the Empress's chambers. He stood with the knife in one hand and his jammed rifle in the other, bleeding from his ears and from a cut on his forehead, his bad leg barely holding his weight. He stood there and waited. When the Atheran Royal Guard finally arrived, a full squad of 12 in their beautiful blue armor, weapons raised and ready, they found the corridor secured. 4 Krev operatives were dead on the floor. 2 humans held the position. One sat against the wall, with a hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, conscious but pale. The other stood in front of the Empress's door, like a wall made of flesh and stubbornness, swaying slightly on his feet, but refusing to fall. Behind the damaged doors, Empress Salith was unharmed. In the adjacent wing, Princess Yulvara stood behind a locked door with her attendants, and through a narrow observation window, she had seen everything. She had watched the limping human fight 4 Krev operatives in a hallway filled with fire and smoke. She had watched him get thrown into a wall by an explosion and then get back up. She had watched him stand guard in front of her mother's door, half broken and bleeding, ready to fight whatever came next with nothing but a knife. The herd animal, the creature she would not let guard a stable. Yulvara's hands were shaking, and she could not make them stop. The medical wing of the palace was quiet, in the way that places of healing always are. Soft lights, careful voices, and the constant low hum of machines doing work that hands could not. Aetheran medicine was centuries ahead of anything Earth had produced. The beds adjusted themselves to the patient's body. The instruments floated on small anti-gravity platforms and moved with a precision that made human surgery look like guesswork. Danny Marsh lay in one of those beds, his shoulder wrapped in a bandage that glowed faintly blue. The Aetheran medics had removed the Krev round, sealed the wound, and told him through a translator that he would recover fully in a few days. Danny had asked if their medicine could also fix his personality. The medics had not understood the joke, but one of them had smiled politely, which Danny counted as a win. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed next to Danny's. The medics had treated his concussion, sealed the cut on his forehead, and done what they could for the damage to his ears. But he had waved them away after that. His leg was swollen and throbbing, worse than it had been in months, but he said nothing about it. He sat with his back straight and his hands in his lap, rewrapping a bandage around his left wrist with the slow, practiced motions of someone who had done this many times before. Captain Ellison came in an hour after the fighting ended. She stood in front of them with her arms crossed and looked at them for a long time without speaking. "You disobeyed my order," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "I told everyone to stay in quarters." "You did." Ellison looked at him. Then she looked at Danny. Then she let out a long breath through her nose. "The Empress is alive because of what you did." "Just happened to be in the area," Danny said from his bed. Almost. I should put you both on report. But you will not, Danny said. No, Ellison agreed. I will not. She placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, a rare gesture from a woman who kept her emotions tightly controlled, and then left to deal with the diplomatic situation that was now unfolding outside. Word of what had happened spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. By morning, every delegation knew. The Krev insurgents had penetrated the oldest and most secure fortress in the Dominion, something that had not happened in over 400 years. The Royal Guard, the pride of Athara, had been too slow, and 2 human soldiers, members of the youngest and least advanced species at court, had held the corridor and saved the Empress. The reaction was mixed. Some delegates spoke about it with genuine respect. Others were uncomfortable, because the story forced them to reconsider assumptions they had carried for decades. A few, privately, were angry, not at the humans, but at the situation. It was easier to dismiss humanity when they stayed in their place. A story like this made that harder. High Steward Rothan spent the morning dealing with the crisis. The palace guard was being reorganized. The security breach was being investigated. The Krev diplomatic presence at court had been suspended pending a full inquiry. Rothan moved through all of this with efficient calm, but there was a tension in his movements that had not been there before. The tension of a man whose faith in his own systems had been shaken. In the afternoon, he went to see Captain Ellison. They spoke in a small meeting room near the guest wing. Rothan stood by the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the city. Ellison sat in a chair across from him, waiting. "Your soldier," Rothan said, "the one who held the corridor. Sergeant Cole." "What about him?" Ellison said. "He fought for the Empress." Rothan turned to face her. His expression was genuinely puzzled, as though he was trying to solve a problem that did not fit any equation he knew. "She is not his ruler. This is not his world. He has no oath to the Dominion, no treaty obligation, no personal connection to anyone in this palace. Why did he do it?" Ellison considered the question. "Because someone was in danger and he could help," she said. "That is what our people do." Rothan studied her for a moment. "That is either very noble or very foolish." "On Earth," Ellison said, "we have found that it is usually both." Rothan almost smiled at that. Almost. Later that day, Princess Yulvara came to the medical wing. She did not announce herself. She came without her attendants, without her usual entourage of courtiers and admirers, wearing a simple gown instead of her formal robes. She told the guards at the door that she was inspecting the wing, and they let her pass without question because she was a princess. And princesses did not need reasons. She walked through the wards slowly, past empty beds and quiet machines, until she reached the section where the humans had been placed. Danny was asleep, his breathing slow and steady, his injured arm resting on a pillow beside him. His rifle was propped against the wall, next to his bed, within arm's reach, because even in sleep, a soldier kept his weapon close. Ethan was in the next bed. He was not asleep. He was sitting up, his back against the wall, wrapping and unwrapping a bandage around his wrist. It was not a medical action. It was a habit, something his hands did when his mind was working. He may not have heard her. The medics had said his hearing was still recovering from the concussion blast. Yulvara stood in the doorway and watched him. This was the creature she had mocked in front of the entire court. This was the human she had called a wounded herd animal, too broken to guard a stable. He sat now in the soft light of the medical wing, covered in bandages and bruises, his bad leg stretched out in front of him because bending it hurt too much. He looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, more human. And yet this same fragile, limping, scarred man had killed 4 Krev operatives in close combat, and then stood guard over her mother's door while bleeding from his ears. Something shifted inside Yulvara. It was not a sudden change. It was more like a crack in a wall, small but deep, the kind that let light through to places that had been dark for a long time. She had grown up in a world where strength meant power and grace and technology, where weakness was something to be discarded, and where species were ranked by what they could build and how long they had been building it. By every measure she had ever known, humans were at the bottom. But the measures, she was beginning to realize, might be wrong. She watched Ethan wrap the bandage once more, his fingers steady despite everything. He still had not looked up. He was not performing for anyone. He was not seeking praise or recognition or apology. He was just sitting there, doing what he always did, enduring quietly, carrying the weight without complaint, waiting for the next thing that needed to be done. Ylvara opened her mouth. She wanted to say something. She was not sure what. An apology, perhaps, or an acknowledgement, or even just his name. But the words would not come. For the first time in her life, the princess who always had something clever to say found herself speechless. She stood there for a long moment, watching the human soldier in the dim light. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the crystal floor. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her chambers and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had seen in that corridor. The fire, the blood, the moment when the human had been thrown into a wall, and the moment, impossibly, when he had gotten back up. She thought about what her mother might say, and for the first time, she was afraid of the answer. The throne chamber was full again, but it felt like a different room. The same crystal walls stood tall around them. The same pale light fell from the ceiling high above. The same delegations filled the hall in their colors and robes and armor. But something in the air had changed. The whispers that moved through the crowd were not the same whispers that had followed the humans 2 days ago. There was no amusement in them now, no mockery. The sound was lower, more careful, like people who were not yet sure what they were about to witness, but knew it was going to matter. Ethan stood with his unit along the far wall, the same position they had been given at the first reception. He wore a clean uniform, Captain Ellison had insisted. But the bruises on his face were still visible, and the bandage on his forehead had been replaced with a smaller one that did nothing to hide the cut beneath it. His leg was worse than it had been since the original injury, and standing for any length of time sent a deep, grinding ache up through his hip and into his back. But he stood. He stood the way he always stood, straight, steady, eyes forward. Danny was beside him, his arm in a sling fashioned from a strip of gray Terran uniform fabric, because he had refused the Aetheran one. "If I am going to be injured," he had said, "I am going to be injured in our colors." He looked pale but alert, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, nervous in a way he rarely showed. "You think something is going to happen?" Danny whispered. "Something always happens," Ethan said. The delegation settled into their positions. High Steward Rothan appeared at the side of the chamber, and struck the floor once with a ceremonial staff. The sound rang through the hall like a bell, and silence followed it the way night follows sunset, completely and all at once. The Empress entered. Salith walked slowly, not because of age or weakness, but because she understood the power of making a room wait. She wore the same simple white robes as before, the same thin silver band across her forehead. Her dark eyes swept the chamber once, touching every face, every delegation, every corner of the vast room. When they passed over the humans, they lingered for just a moment longer. She took her seat on the pale stone throne. Ylvara followed, taking her place in the smaller chair to the right. The princess was dressed simply today, no gold, no jewels. Her face was composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that had not been there before. She did not look at the humans. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. The Empress let the silence hold for several long seconds. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The chamber's acoustics carried every word to every ear, and every ear was listening. 2 nights ago, she began, a force of Krev insurgents breached the inner ring of this palace. They came through tunnels that have stood unused for centuries. They killed 2 members of my royal guard. They reached the sealed doors of my private chambers and began to cut through them. She paused. The silence was absolute. The royal guard response was delayed by 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, the doors would have been breached. I would be dead, my daughter would be dead, the Dominion would be in chaos. Another pause. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing down on the room like a physical thing. But I am not dead, Salith said, and the reason I am not dead arrived in a shuttle 3 days ago, wearing gray uniforms and carrying weapons that most of you would consider primitive. She let that settle. 2 human soldiers, Sergeant Ethan Cole and Lieutenant Daniel Marsh of the Terra 9th Expeditionary Unit, left their quarters without orders, navigated a palace they had never been trained to fight in, and engaged 4 Krev operatives in close combat. Lieutenant Marsh was shot in the shoulder and continued fighting. Sergeant Cole was struck by a concussion charge and continued fighting. Her voice carried no emotion, only precision. She was stating facts the way a historian states them, plainly, because the facts were powerful enough on their own. Sergeant Cole killed the last insurgent with a combat knife, and then stood guard at my door, injured and alone, until my own forces arrived. The chamber was so still that Ethan could hear Danny breathing beside him. Then the Empress did something that made the entire court inhale at once. She stood up from her throne. She descended the steps. Ethan heard a murmur sweep through the hall, not words, but a collective sound of shock. Later, Danny would tell him that several delegates had stepped backward, as if the floor had moved beneath them. Rothan's eyes widened slightly, which for a man of his composure was the equivalent of open-mouthed astonishment. The Empress had not descended from the throne for a foreign delegate in living memory. Some of the older courtiers could not recall it ever happening at all. Salith walked across the floor of the chamber. Every step was deliberate. Every eye in the room followed her. She passed delegations that had served the Dominion for millennia. She passed allies and rivals and kings and generals. She walked past all of them without a glance. She stopped in front of Ethan. He straightened. His leg sent a bolt of pain through his body, and he ignored it completely. He looked at the Empress, and she looked at him, and for a moment the two of them existed in a space that the rest of the room could only observe from the outside. Salith raised her voice so that every corner of the chamber could hear. My daughter called this man broken. The words landed like stones in a still lake. Somewhere behind Ethan, he heard Danny's breath catch. I call him the reason I breathe this morning. She lifted her right hand and placed it flat against the center of Ethan's chest, over his heart. The gesture was slow and formal, and the reaction from the court told Ethan everything he needed to know about what it meant. A sound moved through the room, gasps, whispered words in half a dozen languages, the rustle of bodies shifting as people craned to see. The hand over the heart. Ethan did not know the name of the gesture, but Rothan would later explain it to Captain Ellison. It was called the binding of breath, an Aetheran act of the highest personal honor, given only to someone who had saved a royal bloodline from ending. It had not been performed in over 600 years. Let every world in this dominion know, the Empress said, her voice filling the chamber, that humanity does not earn respect with fleets or technology. They earn it with this. She pressed her hand more firmly against his chest. The will to stand when others fall. The refusal to stay down when the body begs for rest. The choice to fight for strangers as though they were family. She held his gaze. This is what I see when I look at this man. This is what I see when I look at humanity. She lowered her hand and stepped back. The chamber was silent for 3 heartbeats. Then Ylvara rose from her chair. Every eye moved to her. She walked down the steps her mother had descended, her movements careful and controlled, her face holding an expression that was difficult to read. Not shame exactly, but something deeper, something that looked like the pain of growing up in a single moment. She crossed the floor and stopped in front of Ethan. For a moment, she just looked at him. Then she bowed. It was a deep bow, the formal kind that bent at the waist and held, the kind that Aetheran royalty offered to those they considered equals or superiors. The court had never seen a princess of the blood bow to an outsider. Several delegates looked at each other with wide eyes. Rothon gripped his ceremonial staff so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Ylvara held the bow for a full 5 seconds. When she straightened, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, though she would never admit it. Ethan looked at her. He was not trained for this. He had no protocol for receiving bows from alien princesses. He was a sergeant from Earth, who had grown up in a small house with a leaking roof, who had joined the military because he did not know what else to do, and who had ended up standing in a crystal throne room on a planet thousands of light years from home, while an empress called him a hero and a princess bowed at his feet. He did the only thing that felt right. He nodded, respectfully, and said, "Just doing my job, Your Highness." A sound moved through the court. It was not laughter. It was something warmer than that, something closer to recognition. The moment when a room full of people who thought they understood the galaxy realized they had been missing something important. The ceremony ended shortly after. Delegations filed out of the chamber, and the conversations that followed were different from any that had taken place before. Species that had ignored the humans now approached Captain Ellison with words of respect. Delegates who had laughed at Ylvara's joke 2 days earlier could not meet the eyes of the human soldiers. Ethan and Danny walked back to the guest wing together. The corridors felt different now. Servants nodded to them as they passed, and a Theran guard they had never met stopped, placed his fist over his chest, and bowed his head slightly before continuing on his way. "An Empress just called you a hero in front of half the galaxy," Danny said. "I heard," Ethan said. "How do you feel?" Ethan thought about it. "I could really use a nap." Danny laughed, a real laugh, the kind that shook his whole body and made his injured shoulder ache, but he did not care. The next morning, the human delegation departed. The shuttle lifted off from the same platform where they had landed 3 days earlier, rising through the violet sky and the golden light of the twin suns. Ethan sat by the same small window, watching the crystal towers and floating gardens grow smaller below them. Captain Ellison sat in her seat at the front, a faint smile on her face. She had received a private message from the Empress that morning. Full diplomatic channels, trade negotiations, a formal alliance proposal, everything they had come here hoping for and more. Far below in the throne room of the palace, Empress Salith stood at a window and watched the human shuttle climb toward the stars. Rothan stood beside her. "You have opened full diplomatic channels," Rothan said. "May I ask why?" The Empress watched the shuttle until it disappeared into the haze. "Because I have seen what their worst-equipped soldier will do for a stranger. And now I want to know what their best will do for a friend." Rothan considered this. Then he bowed and went to make the arrangements. In her chambers, Ylvara sat alone. On the table in front of her was a small data tablet displaying everything the Dominion's archives contained about humanity. Their history, their wars, their art, their stubborn and impossible refusal to accept defeat, even when every rational calculation said they should. She had been reading for hours. She picked up the tablet and kept reading. Outside, the stars turned slowly, as they always did, ancient and vast and full of species who thought they understood what strength was. They were about to learn.